Hello and welcome to this week's West Asia Post with me, Ghadi Francis, our weekly show where we bring you stories from the world's most volatile region. A lot is happening in West Asia this week, from Joe Biden's shifting policy in Yemen to the ICC ruling which paves way for war crimes probe in Palestine. We have loads of stories lined up for today, but we will start with our top story. West Asia has entered the space race. The United Arab Emirates Hope Probe successfully entered the Mars orbit. Our next report talks about this success story.
The Red Planet has a new visitor. This time from West Asia. UAE's Hope Probe has entered the orbit of Mars, a first for the Arab world.
From the mission's leader to all the teams, to the people of the United Arab Emirates and the Arab and Islamic world, we announce that the UAE has successfully entered the Red Planet's orbit. Thank God, thank God.
The Emirates Mars mission cost around $200 million. The unmanned probe is named Al-Amal, which is Arabic for hope. It was developed by UAE scientists in the United States. Hope was then launched from a Japanese space center last year. It will remain in orbit for 687 days. That is how long a year is on Mars. The Hope probe is expected to create the first complete portrait of the Martian atmosphere. It will study the daily and seasonal changes of Mars and find out if life can really exist on the Red Planet.
For us as a nation, we look at this mission as 90% of it has been achieved. Because this mission was never about just reaching Mars. The government was very clear since day one when this mission was announced that reaching Mars is just a mean for a much bigger objective and goals.
This is a crowning moment for the UAE. It is the fifth space agency to reach Mars, after the US, the former Soviet Union, India and Europe. From Dubai, landmarks glowing red to a Martian ink passport stamp. The Arab world commemorated the success of the mission. But what is even more groundbreaking are the women leading this mission. Women make up 80% of the program's scientific team. In focus is young Emirati Minister Sarah Al-Amiri. When she was a child growing up in Abu Dhabi, her country seemed light years away from reaching for the stars.
Thank you for the question.
But now she is one of the main drivers behind this ambitious project.
And it wasn't something for me that's unfathomable for women to be part of the workforce. And there was no sort of bounds on, no, you're a girl, therefore you cannot be an engineer or you cannot like science.
The UAE first announced plans for the mission in 2014. It then launched a national space program in 2017 to develop local expertise. The Mars mission is part of the UAE's diversification efforts. The Gulf is looking to develop its scientific and technological capabilities, helping the region reduce its reliance on oil. But the UAE's ambitions go much further. It even has a goal of building a human settlement on Mars by 2117.
A cheer broke out.
West Asia Bureau, WION, World is One.
Like always, we will continue to bring you all the latest updates from the heart of the conflict. Don't go anywhere, we have a lot more lined up for today. But first, as usual, let's take a look at what else is making headlines across West Asia.
Palestinians opened election registration offices in Gaza and the West Bank. This comes after rival factions agreed on steps to ensure that the first elections in 15 years go ahead. Iran launches a vaccination drive against COVID-19 with Russia's Sputnik V vaccine. The West Asian country is initially inoculating hospital intensive care personnel. Qatar asked Lebanese leaders to form a new government before receiving aid to drive its economic recovery. This comes as Lebanon is going through its worst economic and political crisis since the civil war. According to Jewish Chronicle, Iranian nuclear scientist Mohsen Fakhrizadeh was assassinated by Israeli spy agency Mossad. The report says that he was killed by a 1-ton gun smuggled into Iran in pieces. A team of more than 20 agents are said to have carried out the ambush.
The International Criminal Court has ruled that it can investigate alleged war crimes in Palestine. While the new ruling has given hope to Palestinians, the Israelis have vehemently objected against it. Let's take a look. The International Criminal Court has delivered a historic ruling. A pre-trial chamber found that the court has jurisdiction over war crimes, those committed in the Palestinian territories. A ruling that paves way for a possible criminal investigation. The ICC said in a statement, and I quote, "Decided by majority that the court's territorial jurisdiction in the situation in Palestine extends to the territories occupied by Israel since 1967, namely Gaza and the West Bank, including East Jerusalem." While the ruling itself is historic in nature, no probe was expected in the near future. Palestine is a state party to the court, while Israel is not a member. But for Palestinians, this is a big win.
The United States of America is the one who really shields Israel from any criticism and prevents us from getting whatever sanctions needed against Israel. Today, the United States of America cannot do anything, to protect Israel, and as a result, Israel has to be treated as a war criminal.
The ruling brings hope of belated justice for victims of Israeli attacks. Rights groups are calling on the tribunal's prosecutor to take swift action.
When I heard about the decision, I was very happy about it. But I doubt that world countries and the world courts will be able to trial the occupation. We hope that the decision is true and will actually trial them and bring justice for the children that were killed in the wars.
The decision is very late, and for us, as Palestinian people who are living under the occupation injustice all these years, see that this decision should have come before. This decision at least will restrain Israel from its compulsive practices against our people.
However, for Israelis, the decision is a worrying one. Israel's Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu slammed the decision as pure anti-Semitism.
When the ICC investigates Israel for fake war crimes, this is pure anti-Semitism. The court established to prevent atrocities like the Nazi Holocaust against the Jewish people is now targeting the one state of the Jewish people. First, it outrageously claims that when Jews live in our homeland, this is a war crime. Second, it claims that when democratic Israel defends itself against terrorists who murder our children, rocket our cities, we're committing another war crime. Yet the ICC refuses to investigate brutal dictatorships like Iran and Syria, who commit horrific atrocities almost daily. As Prime Minister of Israel, I assure you, we will fight this perversion of justice with all our might.
But the two sides agreed on one thing. Neither of them expect a swift outcome from the ICC. The decision comes just weeks after the end of Donald Trump's presidency. This as Biden is shifting towards traditional U.S. policy in the region. Many even call the ruling purely political. But while the ruling is historic, Palestinians are not exempt from the court's scrutiny. It also throws light on groups like the Hamas. Hamas has often been accused of intentionally attacking civilians and even using Palestinian civilians as human shields. But the ICC decision remains an important one. A milestone that could have significant implications in the region. West Asia Bureau, WION, World is One. Over the past few weeks, the forgotten war in Yemen is back in headlines. President Joe Biden ends the United States' support for the Saudi-led offensive in Yemen. In his first major foreign policy speech, Biden said that the war in Yemen must end. But what does this mean for the war-torn country? Let's take a look.
Diplomacy is back at the center of our foreign policy.
That was Joe Biden's assertion after assuming the presidency.
And to underscore our commitment,
diplomacy is back. It certainly is. Unfortunately, so is the haggling and the back and forths. Biden is pushing for a UN-backed ceasefire in Yemen. He has ended US support for the coalition, dispatched senior diplomat Timothy Lenderking as special envoy. Even reversed Donald Trump's last-minute terror listing. But the Houthis aren't making things easy. On Wednesday, they attacked Saudi Arabia's Abha airport. 4 drone strikes that left an aircraft in flames. The Houthis say the strikes were retaliatory, that the coalition hit first. Either way, the United States is not impressed.
Let me first say that we condemn the Houthi attack today at the Abha International Airport in Saudi Arabia, a civilian airport. The attack coincides with Special Envoy Lenderking's first trip to the region and his efforts to bring a lasting peace to Yemen that will ease the suffering of the Yemeni people. The Houthis, meanwhile, continually demonstrate a desire to prolong the war by attacking Saudi Arabia, including attacks on citizens, and we will continue.
No casualties were reported in the strike, but it was the first time a Houthi attack struck a civilian aircraft. Already, there are murmurs of discontent in the United States. What was the need to delist the Houthis, a sworn enemy of a key ally? The thing is, the State Department doesn't see it that way. For them, humanitarian priorities take precedence.
Our planned action, the Secretary's intent to delist, is due, as I said before, to the humanitarian consequences of this last-minute designation. We can do 2 things at once. We can ensure that we do not add to the suffering of Yemeni civilians.
Biden is convinced that the Yemen conflict has a peaceful solution.
One of the darkest days in the history of our nation.
But by delisting the Houthis, he's painted himself into a corner. A key bargaining tool is now gone. As America pursues peace, the Houthis are stepping up attacks. Over the last few days, they mounted an assault on Marib, the government's last remaining stronghold. At least 29 people were killed in the fighting. In a separate attack, 2 Houthi missiles struck near a government facility, but no casualties were reported. The Houthis say the attacks will stop when the coalition stops. Unlikely, considering how personally invested the Saudi Crown Prince is. And herein lies Biden's challenge. He must bring America's Gulf allies on board for a ceasefire. But they will demand concessions from the rebels, a tall task, considering it is the rebels who are winning the war. West Asia Bureau, WION World is One.
Iran celebrated its 42nd anniversary of its 1979 Islamic Revolution. But this year's celebrations were one of a kind, from socially distanced parades to online presence. Our next report takes a look at how Tehran commemorated its revolution.
Revolutions. West Asia has seen its fair share over the decades. But the one that took the world by storm is Iran's 1979 Islamic Revolution. The Iranian Revolution changed West Asia forever, bringing an indisputable sea of change. It began with the rise of prominent Shia cleric Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini. Khomeini spearheaded a revolution. One that led to the fall of the monarchy in Iran. Iran's King Shah Mohammad Reza Pahlavi was ousted, and in his place arose an Islamic Republic. Almost overnight, Iran transformed from a crucial ally of the West to a bitter opponent, one that would then rise to prominence in the region. With time, the Islamic Republic's influence reached far and wide. Iran emerged as a major power in the region. The revolution set in motion conflicts and alliances that West Asia continues to reel from till date. But as Iran marked the 42nd anniversary of the revolution, the celebrations were one of its kind this year. The coronavirus pandemic meant socially distanced parades, and online presence replaced the public show of force. Tehran's iconic Azadi Tower was filled with cars and motorcycles as Iranians paraded on vehicles to avoid infections. But despite the switch to wheel-bound forms of parade, the ceremony's anti-US sentiments remained unchanged. Participants waved Iranian flags from their vehicles. Even a coffin was seen draped in a US flag with a photo of Donald Trump.
If the US continues on the same path it is taking now, our relations will be like two parallel lines, and we will have no conclusion, and a relationship with the US is not feasible. But if the US stops its concitedness, there is hope to have relations with them.
If the sanctions are lifted, well, the lives of the people will be easier and our progress will increase. But these sanctions have also in a way made us stand on our own 2 feet, and in a way serve our dependence on other countries. They have brought us to the conclusion that we need to stand on our own 2 feet.
This comes at a time when US-Iran tensions are undergoing a major change. In focus is the Iran nuclear deal. While the Biden White House wants to rejoin the deal, Iran remains defiant. It will only comply with the deal if the United States commits first. West Asia Bureau, WION World is One.
Israel's Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu was in court. His corruption trial has resumed after multiple delays. This will have huge impact on the Israeli upcoming elections, the 4th in just 2 years. In our next report, we tell you what's in store for the Israeli longest-serving leader.
With just weeks to go before Israel's 4th snap polls, the campaigns are off to a sluggish start. There are no rallies due to the pandemic. As for Israel's Prime Minister, he was in court for an unprecedented corruption trial. Clad in a surgical mask, Benjamin Netanyahu seemed conscious of his demeanor. He wanted to project a business-as-usual attitude. He stayed for 20 minutes, denied all charges against him, and left without any explanation. Israel's Prime Minister faces charges of bribery and fraud. He allegedly accepted lavish gifts from rich friends and repaid them with favors. Netanyahu, on the other hand, denies everything. He says it's all part of a left-wing witch hunt. Netanyahu was indicted in May last year. It makes him the first Israeli Prime Minister to be formally charged. At his first court hearing, Bibi appeared defiant. This time around, he was a lot more measured. He even urged his supporters to not gather in light of the pandemic. Inside, the affairs were more of a formality. Netanyahu pleaded not guilty before staging an abrupt exit. The message was clear. The trial would not affect his administrative responsibilities. Outside the courtroom, the scenes were quite different. Dozens of protesters gathered with blowhorns and placards, the most prominent of which read, "Crime Minister." Protests demanding the PM's ouster have become a weekly affair in Israel.
We came here because we support the law and we support the justice system, and we believe that Benjamin Netanyahu, our Prime Minister, should stand trial like any other citizen in the state of Israel. He has escaped trial for a very long time.
But what impact will this legal drama have on the elections? The chances of a quick resolution are thin. In all likelihood, the case will drag on for years, unless Netanyahu wins the election in March. With a new mandate, he could push for parliamentary immunity or pass laws that excuse incumbent prime ministers from facing trial. As Israel goes to polls for a fourth time in 2 years, there's a lot more at stake for Netanyahu. As Prime Minister, he can battle the charges from a position of strength. As a private citizen, the legal hurdles may appear taller. The question remains, is this the end of the road for Bibi? West Asia Bureau, WION World is One.
Domestic violence is common in Yemen, but talking about it is a rarity. In our next report, we tell you the story of Al-Anud Hussein Sharian, who was disfigured by an acid attack in the war-torn country. Let's take a look.
Married at the age of 12, rejected at just 16 years old, disfigured in an acid attack shortly after. Al-Anud Hussein Sharian's story is a shocking one. An illustration of abuse in a society hit by both war and poverty.
He grabbed me by my hair and poured the acid on me while laughing. He had a smile on his face. He tried to pour the acid in both my eyes. I covered one eye and drops of acid fell in the other.
Now at 19, Al-Anud has agreed to narrate her ordeal, a rare testimony in a country where domestic violence is largely hidden. While Al-Anud has filed a complaint against her husband, he has now vanished and remains at large.
I was tied to the house window by a very long chain. I would go to the kitchen, cook, and go around the house cleaning, wiping, vacuuming, and going to sleep in the room of my husband's wife, chained. It wasn't a married life I lived. It was a slave's life.
Al-Anud describes her years of marriage as hell. After being hospitalized at a clinic where she was once employed, she is now waiting to undergo 3 plastic surgery operations. According to Al Anoud's doctor, the procedures will not only be complex, it will also be very expensive in the war-torn country. But even with the scars gone, the psychological effects are irreparable.
This is the nature of chemical burns. Unfortunately, it is considered as a tragedy for the patient. On top of the physical tragedy, it is a psychological tragedy, especially because the patient is a young woman. So the psychological effects are irreparable. She always gets depressed because she was severely deformed in the face and neck areas when she was a young woman.
Child marriage is a feature of Yemeni society. But years of violence has greatly increased violence against women. When it comes to the status of women in Yemen, the numbers speak for themselves. A 2013 UN survey found that 1/3 of Yemeni women were married before the age of 18. 9% of these women were even married before 15. According to estimates, Yemen had some 4 million married children. Yemen remains the worst humanitarian crisis in the world, and violence against women remains one of its biggest facets. West Asia Bureau, WION World is One.
That's all we have for you on this episode of the West Asia Post. I will see you next week with a brand new lineup, bringing you more stories from the world's most volatile region. Until then, stay home and stay safe. I am Ghadi Francis, and you are watching WION World is One.
WION now available in the United States. Download the app now.
One World Trade Center, that is the one where the impact.
The cause of India's freedom for many years.
I, Donald John Trump, do solemnly swear.
Work in progress.